right, good morning. That was just a little something to wake you all up, get the energy going. We were listening to Onward, Christian Soldiers, which was one of the great anthems of the Progressive era. I'm quite sure it was sung here in Battell Chapel many, many times at one point in American history. And what you're looking at there is the 1912 convention of a new political party that came into being in the United States. For a brief moment, the Progressive Party with Theodore Roosevelt as the candidate. He had already been president of the United States, coming back in 1912 as the Progressive Party's candidate. And Theodore Roosevelt, in that moment, famously said to the rest of the country, what's at stake in this election of 1912, what's at stake for progressives in that moment was, quote, that we stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord. So it's an election with some high stakes. I wanted to start with this because I think it really does capture a little bit about the politics of the Progressive era, which is what we're going to be talking about today. In particular, the urgency that many Americans felt in this period known as the Progressive era, which is about the first 20 years of the 20th century. Deep fears that American democracy was collapsing, that it had been corrupted by massive concentrations of wealth, that the old ways of doing business were falling apart, and a new tyranny that was setting in was going to be the tyranny of capital, the tyranny of the large corporation. And that's a little what Theodore Roosevelt is talking about when he says that. There are also deep fears of the reverse taking place, that what is going to happen to the United States in this moment of social fracture, of social tension, is that you're going to see some form of civil war or revolution emerge. We talked a little bit about political violence in earlier lectures. This is a deep fear for people in the Progressive era, and I think that this anthem, as well as Theodore Roosevelt's cry of justice, speaks to some of that. But I think Onward, Christian Soldiers also tells us a little bit about the ways in which, when we talk about progressivism in the early 20th century, it's really quite different from how we might think about progressivism today. Progressive is one of those words that's kind of waxed and waned in American history. During this period, it is one of the most widely adopted descriptors in American politics, and we're going to talk about what that actually means. By the 1930s, where we're getting on Thursday, a progressive comes to mean something very different, comes to be associated with the Communist Party, with the world of the American left that is particularly concentrated around the Communist Party, and people who might once have been progressives in this era are starting to call themselves liberals, and so we get New Deal liberalism. In the 1950s, 60s, 70s, the word progressive disappears almost altogether under pressures of the Red Scare. But by the end of the 20th century, when liberal is becoming a bad word in American politics, people start looking around for another word to adopt. Progressive has a comeback. And so it's now, once again, a very widely used word in American politics. But the progressives of this era only have some things in common with the progressives of our moment. So your task for today is to forget all of your associations with this word progressive or with the word progressivism, and to transport yourselves back into this moment in the early 20th century when progressive is coming to mean something very powerful in American politics, when everyone, particularly in the election of 1912, wants to claim it. But their progressivism is different than ours. So to introduce us to that, we are going to start out with a man named Walter Lippmann. Students in the class are going to be reading Walter Lippmann's work, Public Opinion, this week. We'll get to that later in lecture. But I want to start with a young Walter Lippmann, who was born in the late 19th century, In 1905, he goes to Harvard University, the age of 16, and he is part of a generation of young people who are looking out at this rapidly changing American society and starting to try to make sense of it. Lippmann at Harvard studied with some of the great thinkers of the era, William James above all, and it was at Harvard that he began to not only think in broad political terms, but as was not so unusual for the young people of the early 20th century, to be radicalized. And he declared himself, upon leaving Harvard, a socialist. His first job was going to work for the mayor of Schenectady, New York. That was one of the wave of socialist mayors who came into being during this period. And like many young staffers, Walter Lippmann lasted about 4 months in his job before deciding that actually he had these big ideas, but municipal politics was maybe not going to be the way that he wanted to work them out. So he left practical politics and spent the rest of his career really as an observer of the American scene, occasionally re-entering government, but mostly standing apart and trying to make sense of what was happening. Students who have not done your archival projects yet, though Lippmann went to Harvard, we have his papers here at Yale. And those papers are an amazing chronicle of most of the first half and even a little beyond of the 20th century, in which he is standing and watching and changing his positions and trying to make sense of what's happening. Well, this was his first attempt. In 1913, he looked out on American politics and was really wrestling with this question of how much to be an idealist and how much to be a pragmatist. And a lot of the energy of progressivism during this era happens at the intersection of those two themes. On the one hand, high moral callings. On the other hand, very pragmatic attempts to create a government that was going to be able to be effective in modern society. So Lippmann looks around in his first book in 1913, he's just in his mid-20s, and says, politics does not exist for the sake of demonstrating the superior righteousness of anybody. It is not a competition in deportment. In fact, before you can begin to think about politics at all, you have to abandon the notion that there is a war between good men and bad men. That is one of the great American superstitions. And then he goes on to say, that expecting too much from politics is only going to disappoint you. You need to be a pragmatist. And yet, you've got to hold on in this moment to that kind of crusading sense that a figure like Theodore Roosevelt captured so well. He went on after this, the following year, to found the magazine that I think best represents a sort of elite discussion during this period about how to make sense of American society. That magazine is known as The New Republic. It's probably a name that's familiar to many people in the room, but it's worth thinking about why they named their magazine The New Republic in 1914. High ambitions to recreate American society in some way that was going to be more just, that was going to be more functional, and that was going to take on and resolve, in its hopes, the great issues of the day. And you can see that in its first issue, The New Republic, a journal of opinion which seeks to meet the challenge of a new time. And these are just some sample issues that followed. Uneasy America. How is the United States going to relate to World War I as it's developing in Europe? Integrated America. How are you going to think about race and immigration in this moment? About woman, women's suffrage, women's politics, women's writing, central to the progressive mission. Then the start of the war into peace, and then the unrest that followed the war. So we are going to wrestle with some of these questions today in lecture in the way that people across American society were really wrestling with them in this period that we call the Progressive Era. Historians, since this moment, have been wrestling with how to describe progressivism, the progressive era, and it remains one of the most contested categories in all of American political history. I picked a few sample works that show you some of the changing interpretations here. In 1934, right, as people are beginning to look back at this moment of the early 20th century, the dominant narrative was that progressivism was all about the people versus the powers. It was about democracy versus the elites. It was about workers versus capital. And that was the theme of the 30s. That's how many 30s reformers looked back on that moment. By the 1950s, a historian named Richard Hofstadter comes along and says, yeah, maybe a little bit, but they were also really annoying moralizers. And they thought they knew everything, and they're not nearly as appealing as you might think. A new generation after that came along and said, not only were they a bunch of annoying moralizers, they weren't even very radical at all. Their whole mission was just setting up government administrations and bureaucracies that were going to protect the status quo and were going to keep capitalism from collapsing, and so on and so forth. So this is an active debate still in the history profession. You can see people put together books that just have question marks as the titles. Who were the progressives? I think there is no definitive answer. One of the kind of seminal works that tried to take this on is an essay from 1982 by a historian named Dan Rogers, who says that by the 1970s, it's called In Search of Progressivism. By the 1970s, when it had barely begun, historians were already attacking the whole notion of a coherent progressive movement as a semantic and conceptual muddle, and they declared it dead and buried. So I would say progressivism is not, in fact, dead and buried, but they're really interesting debates to have about what it is. And I hope you can see that in your writings by Walter Lippmann this week. Part of why it's so hard to wrestle progressivism to the ground is that even within the world of people who called themselves progressives, this kind of big tent moment in American progressive politics, you had people who were diametrically opposed to each other about a whole range of political issues. You can see on the left here, we have two different ways of thinking about the flu pandemic, which came along in 1918 and 1919. Many progressives thinking very ambitiously about public health measures, controls over things like public movement, opening of churches and stores and schools, right? Some of this might sound familiar. And you also had a powerful movement that was resistant to themselves among people who also called themselves progressives. Anti-vaxxers. Anti-vaccination is actually quite a big movement in the early 20th century. Anti-maskers. Everyone's in this coalition and using these words at the same time. Another example is around race and Jim Crow. There is, during the progressive era, a new set of organizations like the NAACP, the anti-lynching movement, that come together in an attempt to, first of all, stop the waves of racial violence that are sweeping across the United States, in particular, to get a federal anti-lynching law. Those movements fail in this moment for the most part. In fact, I don't know if any of you saw this. In 2022, after a couple of centuries of refusing to pass an anti-lynching law, the Congress of the United States has finally made lynching a federal crime. So that happened about 3 years ago, but it did not work in 1922. Nonetheless, you do have a group of progressives who are thinking about resisting Jim Crow, resisting racial violence. And you have a set of progressives who say, no, Jim Crow is actually the essence of progressivism. Progressivism is about good government and anti-corruption and hierarchy and social order. And we're progressives, and Jim Crow is our project. One of those is Woodrow Wilson, who we'll talk about in a little bit more detail later. That is Wilson with his cabinet. When Wilson came in as one of the great progressive presidents, one of the first things that he did was segregate federal employment. And there are other issues that are central to progressivism, but that have lots of divided opinion. Another one is the temperance movement, which really takes off during the early 20th century and is going to result ultimately in prohibition. Women's suffrage is getting its second grand surge, if you remember all the way back to our moments with the Erie Canal and antebellum America. The women's suffrage movement getting its start in the 1840s and 1850s. For many of the people involved, it had been an experience of deep frustration for many decades, but gets a new surge of energy during the Progressive era. Women's politics absolutely central to progressivism. But again, there are many people calling themselves progressives. Woodrow Wilson, a good example again, who do not believe in women's suffrage and who are actively opposed to it. And a lot of that means that the challenge of the progressive era for people who believe that they want to be part of this story of progress, of pushing the country forward, is a problem of coalitions. This is a picture of an early meeting of the NAACP in 1916. It had been founded in 1909. And you can see that there are all kinds of different people trying to come together across issues of race, across issues of gender. There are very complicated class politics during the progressive era as well. People come together, they split apart, and they have many, many, many arguments with each other. So all of that said, there are a few key ideas that are central to how most people are thinking about themselves when they talk about the progressive era and when they adopt this label of progressive. The first is that unlike populism, which David talked about a little bit last week, unlike some other movements that we're going to see later, this is deliberately and quite explicitly a movement that is about urban America. The United States has these growing cities. Increasing numbers of people are moving from the countryside into the cities. And many of the central questions of the progressive era are about urban politics, about urban order, about urban power, about urban political machines. So it's about cities, and for the most part, you're talking about middle-class people adopting this term. The labor movement is having its own politics during this period. Some people adopt the label of progressive. Many do not. For these middle-class people, one of the major concerns is how to, as I was saying earlier, prevent the United States from slipping either into tyranny, a tyranny of capital, how to prevent these big fortunes from corrupting American democracy, from corrupting American politics, and simultaneously how to prevent the United States from slipping back into some sort of revolution or civil war. We are not that far out from the Civil War, a few decades. Many of the people who are alive during this period have childhood memories or more active and recent adult memories of the Civil War and Reconstruction, and so they are aware that things can fall apart, and they can fall apart in ways that are quite dramatic and damaging. The central question, even in all of this grand menu of progressive issues, really is this question of class and inequality, and in particular, two sets of questions. How are these new corporations going to be regulated? What role are they going to play in American life? And secondly, what happens to the people who are losing out under this new system? The homeless, the poor, the wage workers who cannot find stability, who have no safety net, and who are crowding into American cities. You can see that the literature of this period is really centrally preoccupied with this question. Books like Progress and Poverty, or How the Other Half Lives, or The Jungle, Upton Sinclair's famous book about Chicago. One of the most influential writers of the period is Jane Addams, who is in some ways the quintessential progressive. She is a middle-class white woman She goes to Chicago in the 1880s and founds what's known as a settlement house called Hull House. Hull House was intended to both serve the new immigrant populations that were coming into the neighborhood, many of them quite impoverished, and also to study them, to figure out what's happening. That bunch of colors over there that you see is actually a map made by the budding social scientists of Chicago and of Hull House, trying to map out all the different groups and where they live in the neighborhood and what their ethnic identities are and what their professions are. And this kind of social science approach, this belief in expertise, this belief in the ability to study social problems and then come up with big solutions for them, is also one of the really central ideas of the progressive era. Jane Addams in 1902 writes a book called Democracy and Social Ethics, which you saw back there. And she really says that this question of inequality, of poverty, of whether you're going to stand there and look in an American city at masses of impoverished people, she defines that as the call of her generation. She says each generation has its own test, the contemporaneous and current standard by which alone it can adequately judge of its own moral achievements. To attain individual morality in an age demanding social morality, to pride oneself on the results of personal effort when the time demands social adjustment, is utterly to fail to apprehend the situation. The stern questions are not in regard to personal and family relations, but did you visit the poor, the criminal, the sick, and did you feed the hungry? So it's a call to a certain kind of social commitment. It is in some ways a rejection of what we've seen from figures like Alexis de Tocqueville, individualism as the central American project. Not everyone is on board with this, but Jane Addams is a really powerful voice, and she goes on to do all sorts of interesting things over the course of the 20th century. She helps to found the NAACP, helps to found the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom, helps to found the ACLU, and remains at the center of this kind of progressive swirl when it's at its peak in the early 20th century and when it dies away later. I warned you I was going to tell you a few stories from my recent road trips. So if you are in Chicago, you can go to Hull House, and I would recommend it. It's a great museum. So this is me sitting at Jane Addams's desk, and they encourage you to go, to touch her things, to read her books, to sit at her desk, to learn about her legacy. And I found it particularly charming, and this is very much, I think, in the mode of Jane Addams. Hull House is now on the campus of the University of Illinois at Chicago, and the students there started a project which was take a nap in Jane's bed. And so you could go and sign up for an hour. It says over there something like, are you a tired college student? Do you need a little support sometimes? So you can sign up and take a nap in Jane Addams's bed if you are ever around Chicago. And I think what's so lovely about that project is that it really does capture something about her view of what progressive politics was all about, which is that the goal of industrial society ought to be to give the good life, a leisure life, a life in which you can take naps, not just to the rich, but to everyone. So all of that sounds wonderful in some ways, but the challenge of the progressive era was also to figure out how to do some of these things through some rather blunt mechanisms. Those blunt mechanisms include not only highfalutin ideas about progress and the beautiful future that awaits, but also the humdrum world of politics and government. And so now I want to turn over to the world of politics and government, particularly presidential and federal politics, and talk a little bit about what happens during this period. So the first thing to say about the political scene is that, as with the word progressivism, you need to forget a lot of what you know about who's red and who's blue and who belongs to which party. David mapped out for us the fact that the Republican Party, from the Civil War well up into the 1930s, is the dominant national party in the United States. It is a party that is concentrated in the Northeast and in the Midwest. It is understood to be the party of reform, the more progressive party, and the Democratic Party, as a legacy of the Civil War, is still mostly, though not exclusively, the party of the Solid South. In many urban cities in the North, you're beginning to see Democratic as well as Republican political machines. You can see glimmers of the New Deal coalition that we are going to get to on Thursday. But this is more or less what the politics look like in this moment, and the Republicans have been winning again and again and again. And not just Republicans, as David said, Ohio Republicans. This is the great age of the Ohio Republicans. You can see, you can go to Ohio and take a drive on the Ohio Presidential History Trail, which you'll be shocked to hear I have actually done. I thought it was very nice over there that the Pennsylvania Turnpike was having a solidarity moment with the Ohio Turnpike, and encouraging you to go see these Ohio presidents. But during this period, William McKinley, William Howard Taft, Warren Harding, right? They are all Republicans from Ohio. One great exception is the person who is arguably the central figure of formal progressive politics during this era, and that is Theodore Roosevelt. I don't know how many of you have noticed that I'm wearing my Theodore Roosevelt shirt. So this is TR, and that's Theodore Roosevelt over there with his little glasses and his mustache. He is one of these outsized political figures. He is someone who is incredibly well educated, speaks multiple languages, writes lots of books with names like, The American People and Great Heroes of American History. He is someone who is engaged in advocacy of what he calls the strenuous life. One of the great anxieties of the progressive era is that old-fashioned masculinity is dying in this world of cities and office jobs and corporations. And Theodore Roosevelt is the great champion of a kind of manly way of being in your body, but also being in the body politic. So he is not from Ohio. He is from New York. He's from a wealthy family in New York, somewhat unusually for people of his class. He started out getting involved in state politics, and then he moved on to one of the great causes of the progressive era, or of the Gilded Age, really, in the late 19th century, and he became a civil service commissioner. And a lot of the diagnosis of what was going to help American politics survive in this new, complicated, modern world was placed in the civil service and in the world of what was coming to be called the administrative state, right? The idea that if you wanted to understand this complicated world, make policy, as well as prevent corruption, you were going to need smart, educated people who were going to make careers of government service, who were going to stand outside of party politics, and, as Jane Addams was doing at Hull House, study the great social problems of the age, make policy, and administer them for the public good. So Theodore Roosevelt comes up saturated in those kinds of ideas. He also becomes police commissioner of New York for a while. These questions of order and urban order in particular, very central. And then in the late 1890s, really makes his name on the nationwide stage by leading a group of volunteers into the Spanish-American War. He calls them the Rough Riders, and here they are triumphantly atop their hill in Cuba, planting the American flag. Theodore Roosevelt's ideas about empire and expansion are one of the most interesting parts of his story. It's really what thrusts him onto the national stage. Like many people during this era, he has very clear ideas about racial hierarchy and the way that that ought to fit into that story as well. For this lecture, we're really going to focus on his ideas about domestic politics and about this central question of the age: how, in an era of large corporations, of growing inequality, of mass immigration, do you make American democracy function? There are lots of movements and initiatives during the progressive era to try to rejigger the essential elements of electoral politics, how voters engage with the government, in order to try to make democracy more responsive. This is the moment when we get the direct election of senators. It's a moment when initiative and referendum, particularly in places like California, gets invented and implemented. It's also the moment that the first primary elections begin to happen. Though they're not binding at this point, they look a little different from what we have today. But that's one set of initiatives. You've got to open up the government, make it more responsive to the actual voters, get it out of the corrupt state legislatures. Theodore Roosevelt, who, by the way, becomes president only once William McKinley is assassinated in 1901. We talked a little bit about that last week. He's something of an accidental president. He comes into office as a young man, but he comes in and he really makes his name around two big issues. The first is going after, at least rhetorically, if not always practically, these concentrations of wealth that are starting to emerge in places like Wall Street, in the great industrial fortunes. And he is famously willing to declare himself, though he is quite a wealthy man, an enemy of wealth. Here's a pretty typical TR quote: "These fools on Wall Street think they can go on forever. They can't. I would like to be the buffer between their foolishness and the wrath that is surely to come. Sooner or later, there will be a riotous, wicked, murderous day of atonement." Right, so you've got this set of economic questions front and central, and also a sense that this is urgent, right? Something needs to be done. The second thing that he really becomes known for is making use of the presidency, of executive power in new ways. There's a famous interpretation of the 20th century presidency that's called the imperial presidency, right? The idea that in this moment, McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt, the presidency starts to become something very, very different, both because of what Theodore Roosevelt says, which is that the presidency is about having the bully pulpit, right? You can set the agenda from the front of the room. That's what the presidency is. But it's also because this is the moment when the executive branch of the federal government in particular really begins to take off, with a proliferation of agencies and bureaus, and this idea that you need a set of nonpartisan experts who are going to guide you through. Theodore Roosevelt goes on in 1908 to declare that he, like George Washington, despite himself being called a king, right? This is one of the satires of Theodore Roosevelt, that he's going to follow George Washington's example and step down at the end of his second term, even though many people are calling for him to stay in office. And he steps aside for this man, William Howard Taft, both Ohio Republican and Yale man. So he was a Yale graduate. He becomes president, and then he goes on to become a Yale professor for a while before going back to the Supreme Court. I wanted to point out that over in Woolsey Hall, there is supposedly, I think it's still there, an extra large chair for William Howard Taft, because he was famously about 300 pounds, and that is his slightly larger chair. So you can go over and look in Woolsey Hall if you want. Theodore Roosevelt cannot contain himself, however. Taft was sort of his hand-picked successor, but he doesn't like what he's doing in office. And so he re-enters politics in 1910, 11, 12, tries to get the Republican nomination, fails to do that, and he ends up on the ticket in 1912 in the Progressive Party rather than the Republican Party. So that is where we started out this 1912 Progressive Convention. 1912 turns out to be one of these seminal elections. It is an election in which basically every major candidate is calling himself a progressive, but they mean different things when they say it. There are certain issues where they come together, but they are also ferociously opposed to each other, at least in an electoral sense. You have Eugene Debs on the Socialist Party ticket. You have Theodore Roosevelt on the Progressive Party ticket, Woodrow Wilson as the Democrat, and William Howard Taft as the Republican. And I think you can probably get a sense from these images where the vibes of this campaign are that, Taft's big slogan is, he's all right. It's not exactly the most rousing slogan. 1912 also becomes the moment of the first campaign film, the first essentially TV ad, what will become no TV yet, but film ad in American politics. I'm going to show you just a minute of it because I think it's interesting to see the ways in which the style of political advertising has changed and then the ways in which its messaging has not changed at all, right? So this is a Democrats ad on behalf of Woodrow Wilson against Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. It's a silent film. It's black and white, goes on for 9 minutes. I will show the whole thing at the end for anyone who wants to sit around and watch it. But I think you'll be able to see the class politics of this moment, the attempt to claim being the party of the people. The old way is the Republicans. So this is a plutocrat's office here, and he's just hung up a portrait of Theodore Roosevelt. Now, sort of buffoon hanging up a portrait of William Howard Taft. And we're going to have all right, so here's our plutocrat coming in. This is the representation of the Republican Party, the big belly, the top hat, and of course, the slightly foppish servant in his livery over there. And here is a nice progressive reformer coming up, giving him a note about charity. This says, will you help with our hospital? We are struggling and desperate, and we need your help. The cities of America, the struggling poor people of America need your help with a hospital contribution. And no, he is a terrible man, and he is not going to do this. Give you one other incident. So these are a couple of workers coming in to try to plead their case with the Republican Party. It didn't go well. So he is not going to help them, unlike the Democrats who will, what? You're lucky just to be working, etc. So you get a sense of the politics of that moment. This is the last scene that comes up, which I thought was very funny. This is an appeal from the Democrats to get you to send in $1, and I feel like it looks exactly like the texts that we all get 1 million times a day from various candidates. So this is the birth of that. All right, 1912, Woodrow Wilson wins the election. And there are a couple of things that are really significant about Woodrow Wilson. One is that, like Theodore Roosevelt, he is a progressive. He is an intellectual. He's a political scientist. He made his name writing books called things like The Administrative State and A History of the American People. Right? So he is a scholar, an intellect. He'd been president of Princeton University. He is also a Southerner, and he is the first Southern-born president since the Civil War. David talked about the question of when Reconstruction really ended. Did it really end in this moment with Woodrow Wilson's election? There's a case to be made that that is in fact true. As I said, on racial politics, Wilson resegregates federal employment. He shows Birth of a Nation in the White House. So he's deeply saturated in a kind of Southern politics, reconciliationist politics, white supremacist politics that are very common during this era. But he's also deeply saturated in some of the biggest ideas of other parts of the progressive movement. And like Theodore Roosevelt, he becomes a champion. There's Woodrow Wilson. He becomes a champion not only of thinking about ways that economic regulation can play a new role in relation to American democracy, but also thinking about the use of executive power, of administrative power, to bring new forms of expertise and civil service into the government. And in his first couple of years in office, you see this real profusion of kind of quintessential progressive legislation. The Federal Reserve comes into being in this moment. Lots of debates about whether is that a constraint on Wall Street? Is it a tool of Wall Street? But nonetheless, it's one of these quintessential progressive institutions. The Federal Trade Commission comes in. The Census Bureau expands. And when you get to Walter Lippmann, you'll see that he is a big fan of these sorts of expert social scientific bureaus, agencies, committees, commissions as the thing that's going to get the country through all of its political turmoil. One of the great questions is what would have happened with all of this had in 1914 World War I not broken out in Europe. And I want to finish in these last few minutes by just talking a little bit about the war as we did on Thursday and some of the things that it wrought in American society. So one of the most important pieces about the United States in World War I is that it took a very long time for the United States to enter hostilities. War started in the summer of 1914 in Europe. The United States does not enter until April of 1917. And what that meant was that there was a long period of time when Americans in general and progressives in particular could argue about what the significance of the war might be, what its consequences might be, and whether or not the war could be used for some of these higher aims that had been so much a part of the politics of that era. And many of them are thrilled when, on April 2nd, Woodrow Wilson goes to the US Congress, asks for a declaration of war, and does so in this language of high ideals, of American democracy, of making the world safe for democracy, of fighting a war that's going to end all wars. Many progressives get behind Woodrow Wilson in that moment, not only because they see themselves invested in that particular mission, but also because they have an analysis that the emergency of war allows for a buildup of government administrative capacities, social capacities, economic capacities that are really hard to do in moments of peace. And so there are great ambitions among these reformers that World War I is going to be the key to the whole thing. It's going to allow them to realize these dreams that they have been thinking about for decades at this point. There are others who say, I'm really not so sure. I think maybe that's not really the way war works. One of those is a young left-wing writer named Randolph Bourne. He looks at some of his friends and mentors, people like John Dewey, who are saying, this is going to be great, right? We're going to be able to realize all of our dreams through the mechanism of war. And Bourne is saying, I don't think this is what's going to happen, friends, and I'm really shocked that you would be saying that. Here's a quote from his essay, War and the Intellectuals. It has been a bitter experience to see the unanimity with which the American intellectuals have thrown their support to the use of war technique in the crisis in which America found herself. Socialists, college professors, publicists, New Republicans, there's Walter Lippmann, practitioners of literature. This is a war made deliberately by intellectuals. And it didn't take long for some of these pessimistic predictions to emerge. We talked last time a little bit about the attacks on and restrictions on political radicals, people who dissented from the war, people who have been involved in the Socialist Party and other organizations of the left of that point. In many ways, the progressive tent in 1912 was a pretty big tent. You had some real leftists kind of in the mix. One of the things that the war does is really cleave off that whole left. Eugene Debs, who had run against Theodore Roosevelt and Taft and Wilson in 1912, got 6% of the vote. By 1918 is in federal prison, and then runs in 1920 from federal prison. That continues after the war in what becomes known as the post-war Red Scare, when many prominent radicals are not only jailed, but some of them are deported from the United States, many of them back to the Soviet Union, figures such as Emma Goldman, in retaliation for their wartime dissent. So from this very moment in 1917, the war really splits progressives from folks further to their left. But in other ways, the war does become an expression of progressive ideas. By its very nature, this challenge of taking the United States, which does not have a particularly large standing army in this moment, mobilizing an army, getting it equipped, getting it trained, getting it sent across to Europe, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, is a gigantic administrative task. And many people who have great belief in new boards and new ways of mobilizing production, all of this comes to fruition, at least briefly, in the mobilization for war. And many of the movements of the progressive era do seize upon the moment of the war to make their case for action. Women's suffrage, would it have happened in this moment without the First World War? It's hard to say, but it's quite possible that the answer would be no. But women make a powerful case in this moment that if you're going to fight a war for democracy, that entails letting half of your population actually participate in the democratic process at home. There's a moment of real radicalism in 1917 and 1918 in which women are protesting in front of the White House, sometimes being jailed for their protests. But of course, ultimately, women's suffrage does come about in time for the 1920 election. Same thing with prohibition, right? The temperance movement has been going on for decades and decades and decades. And like women's suffrage, it had had some success at the local level, but the process of mobilizing for war, the call to war, ultimately gives it a national momentum that it didn't have before. How are you going to send your soldiers off to be disciplined men if they're all drinking? How are we going to maintain the home front as a place of virtue and support if there's too much drunkenness? So like women's suffrage, temperance and ultimately prohibition is one of these reforms that comes out of the First World War. But in most ways, the war turns out to be a period of disappointment, of shock, of horror, because it turns out that even if you have high ambitions, even if you have great ideals, war has its own momentum. And by the time you're getting to the end of the war into 1919 and 1920, many American progressives are talking about this as the great disaster of modern civilization, a repudiation of everything that they had been arguing, which is that by human will and planning and studying and energy, you can create a future. You can create progress in which the future is going to be better than the past. Well, World War I does a lot of damage to that idea. Millions of people dead, and seemingly for not much reason in the end. Wilson goes to Europe to help with the post-war settlement. In many ways, he is the central figure of that story, and he arrives with many of those big ideas about democracy, about the self-determination of nations that he had been talking about before. In particular, he is a great advocate of the League of Nations, which was supposed to operate a little bit like the United Nations, which comes along later, a kind of quintessential progressive idea. You're going to get a bunch of people together to have these conversations, to study and work out their problems together. Wilson is a great advocate of it, but the United States rejects it. And so while the League of Nations does come into being, the United States, as you can see here, is the missing piece of the bridge. For many progressives, the sign that the era of big hopes and dreams is coming to an end is the election of Warren Harding, who is an Ohio Republican. And in fact, in 1920, the presidential election is between Warren Harding, an Ohio Republican, and James Cox, an Ohio Democrat. And so we have not moved out of the old era into the new, as many people had hoped. And I just want to end by turning back to Walter Lippmann here, this young man who we saw in 1913, 1914, looking out into this world of big progressive ideas, trying to think about idealism versus pragmatism, trying to look at the great social questions of the age. He was in the US Army and ended up going to Versailles as an advisor to Woodrow Wilson, but he comes back to the United States really thinking that maybe everyone got it wrong, and that the central questions of modern society were not going to be these questions about economics and class and democracy, but they really were going to be a set of questions about communications and propaganda and the ways in which pernicious messaging can lead people in the wrong direction. And so that's public opinion by 1922. That's the question he's saying is going to be the question of the future, that this whole period of struggle around economic questions is maybe coming to an end, and we have something deeper to think about. So I'll just end with a quote from Walter Lippmann, Public Opinion in 1922. He says, "The practice of democracy has turned a corner. A revolution is taking place that is infinitely more significant than any shifting of economic power. None of us begins to understand the consequences, but it is no daring prophecy to say that the knowledge of how to create consent, how people relate to information and misinformation, will alter every political calculation and modify every political premise in the years to come." So we will leave it there for today. That's where you can come into engaging public opinion. I'm going to put on the old and the new for those of you who want to watch a 9-minute silent film campaign commercial. We'll see you on Thursday.